Hi everyone. So today's video is brought to you from Luke 2, and this is actually a verse the Lord's been giving me for a long time, and I just never sat down and dug through it and asked him what he was saying. I had a few things that came to mind, and then I would move on, and he would bring it up again, and I would still have, the same thoughts. I never really took the time to ask him about the deeper meaning. So I finally did, and he gave it to me. So the verse is Luke 2:24, but I'm going to read 22 and 23 also, just for some context. It says, "When the time came for the purification rites required by the law of Moses, Joseph and Mary took him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every firstborn male is to be consecrated to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice in keeping with what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of doves or 2 young pigeons." So what he was showing me about this and why they had to bring 2 young pigeons or a pair of doves was because there were 2 things. So the first part is that every firstborn male had to be consecrated to the Lord along with a sacrifice. And when you couldn't afford like the goats or the sheep or the bulls, you could offer birds. So they brought the doves and pigeons. And when we go back to the origin of where this started, you can look at Exodus 13:14 through 15. It says, "In the days to come, when your son asks you, 'What does this mean?' say to him, 'With a mighty hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. When Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed the firstborn of both people and animals in Egypt. This is why I sacrifice to the Lord the first male offspring of every womb and redeem each of my firstborn sons.'" So, consecrating the firstborn male to the Lord at the temple was a reminder of the Lord's final judgment and the 10th plague on Egypt when Pharaoh was keeping his people as slaves. And it's a reminder of how the Lord brought his people out of slavery and out of bondage through this action. It was the moment that Pharaoh finally let them go free. So everything in the Old Testament and everything in the Bible is about Jesus. So everything before Jesus points to Jesus. And that's the Old Testament. So when we look at this, we can see that this is what Jesus does, is he sets people free from slavery and bondage. He was consecrated to the Lord and redeemed like every firstborn male. And that's what Joseph and Mary did. Although he was the only one that would go on to redeem humanity to the Lord himself. So that was the first part, is consecrating the firstborn male, which was Jesus at that time. And then the second part of this verse in Luke 2 was that Mary was offering the sacrifice for her purification. So for this, we have to go to Leviticus 12. And Leviticus is such an interesting book in the way the Lord sets up the laws that the Israelites had to follow. And there were 613, and I'll get to that later. So Leviticus 12, and I wrote down a few of the verses from there. So it says, "A woman who becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son will be ceremonially unclean for 7 days. On the 8th day, the boy is to be circumcised. Then the woman must wait 33 days to be purified from her bleeding. She must not go to the sanctuary until the days of her purification are over. After these 41 days, she is to bring to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting a year-old lamb for burnt offering and a young pigeon or dove for a sin offering. If she cannot afford a lamb, she is to bring 2 doves or 2 young pigeons, one for a burnt offering and one for a sin offering." And I thought of the irony of this is that Mary was unclean because she gave birth and was I guess, because of her bleeding. she was unclean. But ironically, she gave birth to the only one that could purify her from that. So just thought that was interesting. So that is the purification after childbirth. Then, so this took me to the burnt offering, because in Leviticus 12:6 it talks about after the 41 days she is to bring a burnt offering for a sin offering. So I looked at Genesis 8:20 in regards to the burnt offering, and I thought, what is this about? And the first recorded burnt offering was actually Noah. And it says, Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it. So this came right after the flood was over, and all the people and animals came out of the ark, and Noah made this burnt offering to the Lord. And when the Lord smelled the fragrance from it, he vowed never to curse the ground again because of humans, or to destroy all living creatures. So it was appeasing to the Lord. And then in Leviticus 1, it talks about the burnt offering as well. In verse 4, it says, the offering made atonement for the person. It had to be an animal without defect, either a bull, male goat or sheep, or a dove or pigeon. And the animal was presented at the tent of the meeting, at the entrance. So that's where God met with his people. The first one of these is when we see Moses, where he was in his tent, and he would walk out into the entrance, standing in the doorway, and that's where God would meet him. And when God showed up, all the people, because when Moses went to his tent doorway, everyone else went to their tent doorway, and then God would show up and talk to Moses, and all the people would see the glory of God, and they would fall down on their faces because it's so intense. So that's where the first tent of meeting was. And then they replicated that at the tabernacle as well. So the high priest and priests splashed the blood on the sides of the altar and the entrance to the tent of the meeting. So the person brought the animal sacrifice, they killed it there, and then they put the blood on the altar and at the entrance. And then they cut up the animal and burned a fire on the altar. So that is the burnt offering. Then we also have the sin offering that Mary came to offer. So in Leviticus 4 and 5, it talks about the sin offering. Now this is for unintentional sin. This is not like the sanctuary cities we have today, which are actually very unbiblical. This sanctuary cities in the Old Testament were for unintended sin, where someone could go and wait out the sentencing for their crime. But the sin offering was for this unintended sin. So if the and there were rules for each person. So if the anointed priest sinned, there was one kind of sacrifice. If the whole community sinned, there was a sacrifice. If a leader sinned, a member of the community, they all had a very specific sacrifice they had to do for each of their sins. There was also one, interestingly enough, it says, if anyone sins by not speaking up and testifying, or touches anything unclean, or takes an oath, they must confess and sacrifice a female lamb or goat, or 2 doves or young pigeons, one for a sin offering and one for a burnt offering. And if people truly couldn't afford any of that, they could offer a tenth of an ephah of the finest flour. So looking at this, now I've worked with animals my whole life. That's been my career. And it is horrifying to me to think about this. These were sacrifices that were happening continually around the clock. And imagine all these animals being sacrificed and blood just all over the tent, or the entrance of the tent of meeting and the altar. And they were pouring blood at the base of the altar. And I thought, oh my gosh, it's like a bloodbath. And I thought, how gruesome was this place? Like, just a continual sacrificing and blood everywhere. And I looked at Hebrews 9:22, which points to why this had to be done. And it says, in fact, the law requires that nearly everything be cleansed with blood, and without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness. So I thought about, like, everything points to Jesus. So obviously this points to Jesus' sacrifice, and which was required his blood to atone for the sin of humanity. And so what this Mosaic blood covenant did was, because animals were being sacrificed around the clock, it showed that no continued amount of sacrifice would be enough to effectively take away the sin of mankind. It just couldn't be done. And so God set up these impossible standards to show them that their own efforts wouldn't do it. No matter how much they sacrificed and confessed and atoned for their own sin, they couldn't keep up. It was not going to be enough. So the other thing it does is point to Jesus' perfect, sinless, once and for all sacrifice. That is the only thing that can take away man's sinfulness. And you can look at Hebrews 9:11 through 15, talks about that. So the Lord gave the Israelites 613 laws to follow, which was an impossible task. And he did that on purpose. Everything he does is intentional. And it just points out, so the law is there to point out our sin, to show us how far we miss the mark from being holy and righteous before God. And it also shows us that it's impossible to please God by following these laws. But God's promise to Abraham comes, and that's through faith. And now we find out that's the only way to enter heaven. Faith does not do away with the law. The law is always there to remind us of how sinful we are. But it also allows us, faith allows us access to this holy God. So we have the laws to show us we can never achieve this thing on our own, but then our faith allows us to get there by putting our faith in Jesus. 1 Timothy 2:5 and 6 says, "For there is one God and one mediator between God and mankind, the man Christ Jesus, who gave himself as a ransom for all people." So faith in Jesus is the only way to God and the only way to eternal life with him in heaven. And it's the only way to be free of our guilt and sin. So with this faith, we don't need sacrifices anymore. The law shows our sin, and faith in Jesus saves us from it. So I just wanted to, there's a lot more involved in all this, but I wanted to give, this is sort of the Cliff Note version, the overview of why the laws are there, what the sacrifices were about, and why Mary and Joseph were sacrificing the doves and pigeons for Jesus, who was their firstborn son. So hopefully that gives you some insight, and definitely do your own research on this and inquire of the Lord and ask him for more depth and information if you want it, because he will give it to you. You could spend your whole life studying just this one thing because it's so pivotal to understanding the atonement of Jesus. So hopefully that gets you started, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.